Hello and welcome back to Documentary Film. And this is Module 4, where we look at propaganda and films made during the Second World War. This is an important aspect of filmmaking because all films are constructs. All films are a form of discourse, and discourses always are constructed in such a way to present an idea. And this is what we want to look at. We want to sort of step back and take a look at the role of documentary filmmaking in terms of being used as a propaganda tool during the Second World War. Now, it wasn't just documentary films. There were a variety of different forms of propaganda, including some of the images you're seeing right now. These were coming out at a time during the Second World War for the war effort, of course, on the side of the Allies, not the Axis forces. But when we look at these films, we have to think of them as explicit forms of propaganda. When I say explicit, I mean that it is very clear that the political viewpoint that is presented cannot be doubted. It is straightforward. It is in your face. There's no doubt as to who the enemy is and who the good guys are. So keep that in mind. That's one of the ways to define propaganda is, the forces of us versus them is pretty clearly stated. We're not asked to reflect on, why we go to war. That's not the point. The point of propaganda is to propagate an opinion, an idea. And in this case, during World War II, it was to say that the war effort was valid, it was effective, it was necessary, and all manner of media had to point in the right direction, especially from North America and Western Europe. Of course, with the exception of Germany and Italy, where the Axis forces, right, the fascist governments of Germany, Italy, Spain as well, and Japan, those forces were the forces that we were going to fight against. So it was pretty clear who the enemy was. Now, propaganda at this point came in a variety of different styles and forms and media. There were interpersonal communications in terms of rallies and lectures and speeches presented by politicians, by government leaders of one sort or another. There were visual media in terms of leaflets, pamphlets, posters, images. Television really was not in full swing at this point. It was very much in its infancy. So it was primarily radio. Radio and loudspeakers were used to broadcast information to the Allied forces as well as Allied audiences to tell them that this was in fact a good thing. Now, more recently, we've had a combination of audiovisual media, which is film and television. And this is kind of where we're at. This is kind of our realm here, specifically film, of course. So you can ask yourself, which would be the most useful and why? Now, they're all pretty effective in a variety of ways, but certainly film, because it has both audio and video, is usually considered to be the most effective candidate because we have an international cinematic language that we can understand. Depending on how the film is constructed, it can be primarily visual in the sense that there's very little audio, very little talking. It's mostly images, and those images can be very powerful. And think about just the way you can construct an image, and specifically the image of Hitler in Triumph of the Will. So which would be the most useful? It turned out it was film. So the criteria for selecting the media is you want to think about how effective it will be in conveying the message that the Allied forces are doing the right thing to combat fascism, identify the enemy. And so the criteria would include these things that we see here: acceptability and credibility. A documentary film seems to have slightly more credibility in the eyes of its viewers than fiction, simply because of the notion of fiction is somehow made up and documentary is not. Well, documentary is still a discourse, isn't it? It's still a construct. So its acceptability and its credibility for documentary films is more easily bought into. People don't like to think as much that it too is constructed to convey a point of view, as opposed to just telling a story, which is, for the most part, what fiction does. Now, its availability, there were theaters everywhere. There still are. Maybe in 2021, there's slightly fewer. Certainly in London, there are a lot fewer theaters. But now we have television and we have social media. So the availability of film is very effective. Now, As the number of theaters have gone down, what's replaced it? Social media, specifically YouTube. And YouTube has got a bazillion people all expressing their opinions on what they think of whether the earth is flat or round, or anti-vaxxers, anti-maskers, people who think that every injection is going to be part of some mass surveillance of the population, etc., etc. Those people are doing the same thing as what documentary films were making, said half a century ago, because it is available. The availability of these films is simply all you need is a computer, and you log into YouTube and off you go. Timeliness. These videos could be made very quickly, usually from a lot of stock footage. They were put together without really a tremendous amount of thought. The thought simply was to win the war. So it wasn't as if there was a specific artistic or aesthetic agenda that was being sort of followed. The timeliness was, this is a war effort. We are at war. There's no time for artsy fartsy stuff. Let's get this document out. Quantity, yes. Print as many copies as you can. Get them out there. Have them shown before the main feature in a theater. And if it's television later on, do the same thing. But get these copies out to as many people as possible. Because to indoctrinate someone into an idea, you need to have it available, and you need to have a lot of copies available for people. And if you can do those two things, the chances are that your message is going to get through. Suitability for the audience. Then obviously, if they are presenting these films to allied audiences, and you are telling those allied audiences that fascism is bad and Nazis are bad, it doesn't really take a whole lot of convincing. Really what's happening at this point is people are simply confirming what they already know, or having confirmed to them what they already know. Is it effective? Oh, absolutely. It still is, because there's not a lot of resistance in the audience that it is designed for to think twice about the message. Now, propaganda itself, if you were to analyze it, it does a range of things, and this is why we want to talk about it being less persuasive as opposed to propagandizing, because one of the first things it likes to do is name calling. This sort of weird association between certain words and certain ideas and forms of behavior. So name calling, certain concepts and policies that are poisonous, the notion of somehow democracy being bad. Hitler is known to have said democracy is a foul and filthy avenue to communism. There are people that are doing exactly the same thing with communism, that somehow if we allow people to exercise their right to do something, somehow it's a slippery slope towards communism or complete anarchy. So there are people that want law and order to the degree that they are willing to give up a lot of things, and are going to be convinced that giving up a lot of freedoms and liberties that they don't realize are as important as they are, because they were somehow convinced that those freedoms lead to communism. So we need to always be careful in that name calling what that actual connection is. As well, to call the Allies, for example, the Allied forces in North America, Canadian and American forces, and most of the Western European countries, the French and the English, fought against the Germans, against the Nazis. And so for us to call Germans Huns or fascists, we're painting literally every single German with the same brush. We're not making a distinction between the government of Germany, its army, and its people. We're simply calling all Germans fascists. So propaganda doesn't work in subtleties. It doesn't work in sort of clearly defining things and saying, well, let's sort of unpack this carefully. No, it's quite the opposite. It doesn't write with a fountain pen. It writes with a fist, right? And the way in which it does it most effectively is by using this kind of name-calling device, because it is a rhetorical device. And to make these strange connections between a particular political affiliation leading to something worse, or something that is now going to be counterproductive to that particular country. But we, on the other hand, can do the same thing. We turn around and we call the enemy Huns or degenerates or whatever. Now, the other thing in terms of propaganda is we need to be very careful of the vocabulary that is used to indoctrinate us. And we seem to rally rather easily around words like nation, religion, truth, justice, unity. These particular words, yes, they are words that we use, but they are really so ill-defined that when we say, for example, nation state, well, what's really ironic about thinking of nationhood is if you want to travel down that sliding scale, if you feel strongly enough about nationhood, you could end up becoming a racist, and you could end up being a fascist, because the fascist government counts on people feeling so strongly towards their nationhood and their identity as a nation that they are able to paunce off to us a whole range of ideas, political ideas, that somehow are going to be beneficial to you if you embrace these, because your nation is all that matters. Keep that nation pure. When in fact, throughout North America, the notion of a pure nation is a misnomer. It doesn't exist. Nations, especially developed nations, first world nations as they used to be called, are multicultural. So the notion of nationhood as somehow being pure doesn't exist. It never has. So we need to be very careful when we see these words to at least try to identify what truth they are talking about. What do they mean by beauty? What is their definition of justice? These things we need to look at very, very carefully. Of course, allies, which would be our side, would talk about democracy in certain ways. The Axis powers would use socialism and communism, against us, because we have government, so we elect and we can overthrow them through by voting them out most of the time. And so each side will always try to attack the other using exactly the same kind of strategy, which is to use these loaded terms. Now, the other issue too is this notion of transferring, right? You're transferring the authority of an institution, a government, church, and allowing individuals to align these different forces together, because now you're transferring political power to a church, or a religious affiliation to a political party. These kinds of things need to be very, very, carefully thought out, because we can end up in a situation where we don't realize that suddenly there is no distinction between, for example, the nation state and religion. And we end up having a government that's run along religious lines. And if we don't agree with that religion, we're out of luck, right? We've just bought into it. These kinds of ideas is sort of this notion of transference of power, that has to be carefully identified, because propaganda films like to kind of elide that, slide that, one inside the other as a good thing, that, somehow everybody's all going to be facing the same way. We're all going to fight the same enemy. And at the end of the day, when the war is over, you don't even recognize your own country. Now, there's a link at the very bottom here, this movie here, Why We Fight. It's very short, but it gives you a clear idea of just exactly what we've been talking about, the kind of sloganeering, the kind of clear propagandizing of the enemy, the Allied forces, the Axis forces. Who are we fighting against? Why are we fighting? And they're pretty straightforward. Another device, too, is this notion of the plain folk, right? Us. Or in Germany, the Volk. And so we try to identify with the common people, the fact that all of us have a stake in this war being a success. We need to overthrow the enemy. And so it isn't just the army. It isn't just government. It's all of us. All of us have a part to play. And this is another form of propaganda, that somehow our behavior here on home soil, because lucky enough, we've never, in Canada, seen a world war, or the US. There have been civil wars, but not the same thing as a world war, which must be a terrifying thing to go through. But the notion that the plain folk are identified as part of the cause. So most people just go, I'm just at home minding my own business. Well, you can't. Everything you do, even indirectly, will affect the war effort in some way. How much materials you use, how much metal you use, how many things you throw out. Can you ration your food? Can you ration this and that? Because the plain folk really have a lot to do with the success of the war effort at home. Once you lose the plain folk, such as the Americans did in the late 60s, when they saw firsthand what the Vietnam War really was, once they lost those people, and the American folks turned against their own government and said, we got to get out of here. This is not right. It took another 5 years, but that's what happened. Suddenly that propagandizing and the lying to people that this is a just cause, it backfired, because suddenly people now could not match up these kind of, nation states and justice and truth and beauty words on one hand, and the ugly reality of the Vietnam War in the 1960s to the American people. So the plain folk are very important in terms of the success of a war effort, because everybody has to play their part. Everybody has to sacrifice something. Now, the other issue, too, is not only are the plain folk should be interested and involved in the war effort, but the idea of it being a popular thing. Everybody's doing it, right? Everybody's jumping on the bandwagon. So when you draw on these common beliefs, whether they happen to be nationhood or the belief in freedom and liberty, although what I mean by questioning those words, freedom and liberty means something very different to different people living in a so-called free society. So people of color, people that are disenfranchised, people who are disabled, people who are working at poverty level. Freedom and liberty means something very different to them than it does to someone who's rich and white. So those words kind of get bandied around and there's no distinction being made. And this is, again, a very clear indication that something is being propagandized towards you. Those distinctions aren't even called attention to. Excuse me. So the bandwagon effect is really important. Once again, a short little film here. Your Job in Germany is about a 5 or so minute film that gives you this notion of what it means to be part of that bandwagon effort, to be part of the many people that are going to be involved in making this happen. And then finally, we have testimonials, right? These are the individual experiences that people have endured, have experienced, and can come back, if they're lucky to come back and haven't died in the process, to come back and tell people, this is how horrible these people were. They did the most awful things to their own people or villages. It was a scorched earth policy, etc. And these things really drive home the idea that the enemy is as awful as they've been told. So testimonials often work in that way. What was happening again, just to use the Vietnam War in America as an example, the testimonials that were coming back were very different. People were having a crisis of conscience. They were having existential doubt as to why they were there. They were there because they had no choice. They had been conscripted. The draft was still on in the U.S. So people who didn't even want to be there were forced over there. So you can imagine the testimonials that these people would have had coming back, if they were even listened to, because there was a whole other issue in the mid-70s, by 1975-76, when the war was officially over. Vietnam vets were often spat on in the street. People just hated the very idea that they were even there and thought, why would you even fight in a war like that? Well, hello, I was drafted. I had no choice. Well, nobody told me that. That's propaganda for you, right? Selective lying, selective truth-telling. All these things are very important. Now, I'm going to take a break here for a moment before we set up the next set of slides. So I just want you to think about these ideas as we now go through some of the specific ideas in Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will. So back in just a moment. Okay, we're back with the second half, or the second set of slides here on Triumph of the Will, the feature presentation, we'll call it, for this week, for Module 4. And Triumph of the Will is we'll say, an infamous film, to say the least. But we need to have a look at it because we need to be able to identify, in probably the most explicit form that we know of, what propaganda is and how it works. So what I want to do here is have a look at it. And I know I don't want to have to say this, but I'm going to. This class not in any way, shape, or form condones this film, the content of the film, the Nazi Party, fascism, anything. But we need to face the enemy squarely in the eyes. And we need to look at this and ask ourselves, what is it? What is this film? Well, what is it? At the very least, it is a triumph of form over content. If this film was about anyone else, it could be quite striking, because there are many striking images in this film. The content is repulsive. The form is quite compelling. And when we speak about form, I'll mention towards the tail end some of the things I want you to look at and consider, because it is the triumph of form over content. So let's keep that in mind as we work our way through it. So I'm going to click on this. There we go. Okay, so we asked ourselves in the first set of slides, what is propaganda? And propaganda is literally any message that is seeking to change a person's opinion or their behavior. Propaganda of this particular kind is to buy into a political affiliation. In the case of Triumph of the Will, is to buy into the idea that Hitler is somehow a supreme savior that's going to salvage the German, nationhood and the German economy, and is going to get everything all back together again. Okay, everything will be just fine. So, what is propaganda? It is a device, a message, a discourse meant to persuade. But it does it in a variety of underhanded ways. So persuasion can use rhetorical devices, but propaganda seems to be a sort of a worse version of persuasion. Now, who does it target? Well, targets obviously an audience that it wishes to identify with and convert in some way. And if not, it's going to at least confirm what that audience already thinks. So it's either going to confirm what they think or seek to convert someone to thinking in a different way. Now, why is that important? Well, imagine a war effort. You're going to ask people to give up their way of life, start making sacrifices for something they cannot directly see, or at its worst, or at its highest, right? Because it's nation state and all the rest of it, that ultimate sacrifice is your life. You go and fight on behalf of two governments that can't get along, and you could very well lose your life. That's why propaganda is done so effectively, or the hope that it's done effectively. Why? Because you're asking people to go and die for that idea. And that takes some convincing. And really, that's what it boils down to. So what kind of techniques are effective for spreading propaganda? We looked at that. Name calling, the bandwagon idea, the plain folk idea. All these things work together in unison to propagate a message. And again, no matter what the message is, it is still a construct and it still presents a point of view. Now, the question, how can a film be influential in spreading propaganda? For a whole range of reasons. They're easily available. They're often watched in theaters before a feature presentation in the days before TV. And now with the television, we see these films that are still kind of popping out here and there. And a film is identified as propaganda as soon as someone disagrees with it. So as open-ended and as objective as a film can be, it still needs to make choices. It still needs to decide what to show and what not to show. As balanced and objective as those positions can be, somebody can still turn around and label something propaganda. Why? Because they disagree with the point of view. So we can really make that call with anything we disagree with. We just call it propaganda. And it doesn't matter what it is. Safe injection sites, wearing a mask, social distancing, staying home unless you absolutely have to go out and do something. People that don't agree with it consider that propaganda. And we're scratching our heads going, what kind of special stupid are you? But that's the way it is. So propaganda films are really any film that another person disagrees with. But is it influential? Absolutely. And film, we can now include video because, like I said at the beginning of this presentation, there are a bazillion videos that are not peer-reviewed, that are not licensed, that do not have to be objectively tested and checked and make sure that every fact that they present, even though it is an opinion disguised as fact, they don't have that. So anyone can post anything on YouTube, doesn't matter what it is, and it'll be on there. And you'll find an audience because there are like-minded people that think they are independent thinkers, and their idea of research is, they go on YouTube. So we need to be very careful of that. So when we talk about propaganda, it isn't always just film. Sometimes it is just pure spectacle, right? The spectacle of a royal wedding. Why is, the train of a royal wedding dress 35 feet long? Because it can be. they've got lots of money. And one of the ways to show that they have a lot of money is to do outrageous things like that. Everything's over the top. The train is 30 or 40 feet long. They've cordoned off the entire city. Everything is a pomp and circumstance. That is still a form of propaganda. People buy into it. People enjoy the spectacle. So it isn't just film, but certainly visually, any kind of visual message people seem to respond to it more effectively than something that you have to read or something that you have to listen to, because often just using your eyes may be all you need to do. So in general, propaganda is any kind of message that is designed to persuade its intended audience to think and behave in a certain manner. The most explicit forms are to buy into a political ideology. Now, they're also the most dangerous, because Triumph of the Will was asking us to buy into fascism, right? To buy into somehow this notion of a military leader saving all of us as this new God. And clearly he failed. Thankfully, he failed. So institutionalized, systematic spreading of information or disinformation or misinformation or selective truth-telling, any of those forms are forms of propaganda. We're not telling the truth. So we're spreading information, and we're doing it in a way that presents our point of view as the only one. Because remember, propaganda is not there to make you think. It's there to make you react. So propaganda means, an arm of the Roman Catholic Church, even to the propagation of faith, the idea that if we don't, we'll go to hell, right? If you're a Roman Catholic. That's an either or option. And this is what makes propaganda work. It's never this or this or this. It's not asking us to think. It's not asking us to criticize. It's not asking us to make a choice. We're saying the message is saying, do this or else you will be considered an outsider, an exile, a degenerate, communist, or whatever. So we need to understand how propaganda works. So in the 20th century, during not one but two world wars, the propaganda machinery became very, very effective. And the one we're going to look at, it was very effective at distorting facts and spreading falsehoods under the guise of, nationhood and truth and justice and beauty and so on. All these things were about this very large and broad message that ultimately was a political message. Buy into this idea. So this next slide here is just a series of quotes from Leni Riefenstahl, who actually got her start in the 1920s as making what was called mountain movies. And these would be movies that are set in the Alps or the whatever mountain range that was traveling through Germany or Switzerland. And she got her start as an actress making these mountain movies. And then she directed a few and became really good at it. And eventually was approached by the Nazi Party to put together this film. Now, in the book, although for this week, I'd like you to finish reading Peace Between Man and the Machine, Ziga Vertov's Man with a Movie Camera. I also want you to take a look at the next chapter for next week, which, of course, I'm flipping through it here to try to find it. But it's called The Mass Psychology of Fascist Cinema, Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will. So you'll be looking at that next. But I think, and I recommend seeing the film first so that the document makes a bit more sense. So Leni Riefenstahl have said a variety of things, such as, if you see this film again today, you ascertain that it doesn't contain a single reconstructed scene. Well, that's true. Making some kind of veiled reference to Nanook of the North, where scenes were at least structured or controlled in some way. No, they may not have been reconstructed, but that Nuremberg rally was created in order to film it. So it's not as if there's a single reconstructed scene. The whole damn thing is one giant construct. The rally was held specifically to film it. So it was there. People attended. It was a rally. People spoke. But it was completely constructed in order to highlight this burgeoning Nazi party or the National Socialist Party. So that's one thing. She says everything in it is true and it contains no tendentious commentary, sort of questionable commentary at all. It is history, a pure historical film. Once again, there is the fact that the rally was constructed, first of all, as I mentioned, in order to create this milieu in which the film would be filmed. It was a set. The Nuremberg rally was a set. Yes, people attended, but it was a set. Cameras were strategically placed in a whole range of different places in order to capture all kinds of different angles, and sort of high, low, distance shots, close-ups. The whole thing was constructed as if it were a film, but it happened in real time. So the difference between filming something in a studio and filming it live, we'll say. Well, this was shot live. So is it history? Technically, yes. Is it constructed history and it was created specifically for the existence of this film? Yes, it was. So pure historical film, that's a misnomer. It did occur, but it occurred in order to be filmed. She writes, it reflects the truth that was then in 1934 history. It is therefore a documentary, not a propaganda film. Well, we beg to differ, because it is a document, but it is riddled through and through with propaganda messages, and this is what we want to look at. And then she says, yes, I know very well what propaganda is. It consists of recreating events in order to illustrate a thesis, or in the face of certain events, to let one thing go in order to accentuate another. Yes, but there are many things that this film leaves out. It tries to construct a particular narrative that everybody in Germany believed in Hitler. Everybody embraced these ideas. And not once does it mention any kind of resistance, political or otherwise, to the notion of the Nazis coming into power. So, yeah, what it presented may have been truth, but it left out an awful lot of objective facts. So, Hitler wanted a film which would move, appeal to, and impress an audience which was not necessarily interested in politics. When you live under a fascist government, everything you do is political. So every last movement, every last thought you have under a fascist government, they want to know about it. So to impress an audience that was not necessarily interested in politics, maybe at that point they weren't, but it became pretty clear that once the fascists got into power, everything was up for grabs. Everything was political. So, although Eifenstahl talks about this being a document, not a fiction film, it was a historical fact. Let's take a look at how many people she had working for her. Her crew had 172 different people, 10 technical staff, 36 cameramen and assistants, 9 aerial photographers, not 1 or 2, but 9 aerial photographers, 17 newsreel people, 12 newsreel crews, 17 different lighting men, 26 different drivers driving around, following Hitler, following the crowds, 37 different security personnel. There was a huge number of people filming this thing. It wasn't a crew of half a dozen or 2 or 3, 172 people. In each of them with a specific goal in mind. So, how did we get to this point? Now, in terms of the end of the First World War, Germany was decimated. It lost the war. So, there's an economic downturn. There is mass depression, economic depression. I'm sure there was depression, but there was an economic depression because the economy, which during the First World War had gone 100% into the war effort, had nothing to show for it. So they had to basically rebuild everything. And people were reluctant to invest in Germany because they were considered to be the enemy. So all that money had to be raised internally. So this is also about a year and a half after the beginning of this German Renaissance, right? And again, that nation state, the people's community, the Volksgemeinschaft, and that term, right, Volks, the people, the folks, the notion that this is a groundswell, this is coming from the people, right? They want Hitler, they need the savior, they want the savior to help them. Now, what is happening is things aren't going so well in terms of the economy. Politically, democracy is really in tatters as well, because this is something that's also worth knowing, is democracy is a fragile thing, and it can be destroyed very quickly and very easily. And fascists know this. So you can dismantle You can dismantle democracy very quickly. It takes a lot more effort to sustain it than it does to knock it down. And so here's a country on the brink of war, and along comes this savior named Hitler, who's going to save the day and fix everything, and the economy's going to come roaring back, and they're going to become a world nation. And next thing you know, we're down the slippery slope and into this, 1,000-year reign of German power. Wow, okay. And this was all within a very, very short month. So from simply wanting to fix the economy to essentially take over the world, that was in a very, very short time. So what are some of the concerns that citizens of Germany would have had? At the very least, the economy needed to be fixed. The Deutschmark was worth nothing. People were wallpapering with it. That's how worthless it was. It meant nothing. It had no value. So these people were ripe. And to make an example, 5 years ago now, when Trump ran for U.S. president, he did something very similar. He promised to those people, to the American people who were sick and tired of government, sick and tired of being lied to, sick and tired of being looked over, sick and tired of just simply suffering for a whole range of different reasons. He comes along and promises them the world. I'm going to fix this. I'm going to bring back coal jobs. We're going to repeal all these things that you hate. And yeah, he did some of those things. But he tapped into the people's community. So the Volksgemeinschaft in the U.S., and every country has them, people that are just downtrodden. And they want to be reassured that they're going to be heard. So for anyone to think that Trump was an anomaly or somehow a one-off thing that, was just a freak of nature. No, this is decades and decades of American government ignoring a vast percentage of the population and only appealing to money, only appealing to industry and business. The end result is people who aren't making tons of money fall further and further behind. So why do these people think that Hitler was a good idea? To get back to our topic, because they needed a savior. They wanted a savior. They were gullible enough to not think twice about it. So the film itself, right, the formal aspects of the film work very well to present to us the notion of a savior, right? Somebody who literally comes in from the clouds like some kind of god. So Riefenstahl, even though she says that, this is not propaganda, we can see those various techniques that the Nazi Party used and Riefenstahl herself used in order to make us believe, or at least make the intended audience believe, that Hitler was their guy, right? He's my boy. And so there are individual shots that we see. One that we can see, just a very quick one here on this slide, the fact that, young kids were involved in the Hitler Youth, right? So you've got the Hitler Youth. So at a very young age, you are indoctrinated into this idea. And so the notion that there was something there for everybody was quite remarkable. Now, in terms of the technical aspects, so I just talked a moment ago about the content of a shot, but the types of shots, and there's a range of them in this film, which again, if this had been about anyone else, this would be an interesting film because we can separate the form from the content. The content, again, repulsive, horrific, awful to think about. But formally speaking, it does do some interesting things. Okay, so we have low-angle shots of Hitler during his speeches. We have a few others as well. But what does that do? Well, for one thing, it's us looking down or, from a lower position, looking up at Hitler. Like somehow he's larger than life. That somehow he's bigger and taller and more human than human. So these low-angle shots put the viewer at this lower position, physically and, of course, politically, at a lower position than Hitler. So it gives his speeches a sense of drama, that somehow he's this larger-than-life character. Telephoto lenses distort, right, the size of the rally. We see large groups of people compressed into the shot. So it just looks like these blocks of people, like blocks of military people or audience. So it really looks like, my God, everybody on the, in Germany loves this guy. They're all here. But what the telephoto lens does is it compacts and distorts the actual shape and size of a room. It makes things look more boxy than they really are. There's also aerial photography. The airplanes, I should say, that we see coming in at the very beginning, flying, in amongst the clouds. Of course, we see the plane, which means another plane had to be filming it. So there were several aerial, shots at the very beginning that gives this sense that somehow, Hitler's a gift from God almost. Now think of Trump. He's a gift from God. He's a gift from God. That's terrifying. So anybody that was afraid that Trump could have become a fascist, that's where it came from. That is the terminology. So aerial photography associating Hitler as somehow coming out of the clouds. We've got blimps, we've got airplanes. He's coming from above, right, where the gods live. So that's another one. The use of editing. Now, I mentioned earlier, in fact, the first week when we talked about direct cinema and cinema verite, this has to do with the camera, the movement of the camera, and its ability to kind of either be a fly on the wall or to be out on the street and interacting with people. There's also editing, and editing is just as important because, as we saw last week with Eisenstein, there's a variety of, there's metric editing, tonal, overtonal, intellectual editing, and to create a montage. And these montages are also being used here, which is kind of ironic because Eisenstein was a communist. He was a Marxist. So Riefenstahl really doesn't worry about that part. She's only looking for techniques. What's the best way to present this person? How can we whip up a kind of intellectual frenzy over this guy? We can do it through editing. So rhythmic editing to build up emotion, the emotional impact of speeches. All these things are very effective because they all combine together. The low-angle shots of Hitler, telephoto lenses to compress these huge crowds, aerial photography to make us think that Hitler is a god, that rhythmic editing to build up sort of a kind of almost degree of energy, close-up shots of the crowd, all listening, they're in awe of this person. And the other thing too is look at the number of different kinds of people, right? Men and women, young, old, little kids, a cat even stopped to watch Hitler. What this means is everybody loves this guy. Everybody is enamored with him, and everyone is there to see him. So visually, Riefenstahl is implying that everybody in Germany is on board with this guy by having shots of different kinds of people. So it says, oh, okay, well, everybody's in on this guy. What's the problem? And they're finally shooting from the top of flagpoles and other weird sort of angles that are not normally seen, but they're still very effective. So the whole point of this film is almost to have it as a kind of religious experience because it is a congregation. The congregation meets at the Nuremberg rally, and they are there as part of the congregation that eventually will become, followers of the fascist or the Nazi party. And of course, the notion that Hitler is coming in from the clouds, from the gods, he too is presented as this kind of human deity. We see him sort of with a halo of light often. And all these things really puts, Hitler in a very particular light. Not peculiar, but a particular light, which is that there's an equation being made of Hitler as a kind of human deity. It clearly is not. But visually, Riefenstahl is trying to create this idea. So the notion of power and religion clearly is there. The power of spectacle is also there. The hugeness of it all, the number of people, the number of flags, and all the rest of it. So all these kinds of things are working to create this kind of religious, experience. But certainly the notion of Hitler as a human deity is the primary one. So what is taking place that is religious? Well, yeah, that rapture, that sense of rapture and connectedness and community and the congregation all sort of, believing completely and wholeheartedly in this person. So there is clearly something that is religious that is going on because at the very least, that's kind of what it even looks like. Now, the opening shots are very important. Hitler coming down from the clouds. He, was using air travel, which is certainly something that was fairly new. There's always an association, especially in the beginning, before the rally itself begins. There are quite often associations made between cathedral spires, churches. There is the parade finally stops and it's held in front of Nuremberg Cathedral. There are shots of bishops standing within the SS hierarchy. So there is clearly, visually and politically, a relationship established between religion in Germany and the SS, right? The SS, the Nazi Party, the Nationalist Socialist Party. There is a clear distinction, an interaction between these two forces. So yes, is there something religious going on? Absolutely. And that's how it's happening. This is another quote by Kevin Hajopian, I think is how it's pronounced. He says, Riefenstahl invest considerable weight in Hitler himself. The scenes of his climactic speech to the multitudes in the indoor party hall, interminable as discourse, become mesmerizing as political theater. And that is something that is going on in terms of propaganda. Political theater, empty ritualistic gestures, spectacle. It's clearly and purely spectacle. Hitler calculates every gesture, expression, and intonation as a facet of a screen character. Hitler, leader of the people. One moment it's expansive, laughing and joking with his people. Next, he is abstracted, so lost in deep responsibility of leadership that he seems not to be able to hear the ecstatic applause as he looks over his notes. Hitler's moves, every one of them, whether bellicose or pathetic, are designed to elicit a Pavlovian response from the crowd. He acts and sounds and looks like a leader. He may have been an empty shell of a human being, but he acts the part. So the facets of a screen character, he knew how to push people's buttons. And so between the presentation of Hitler as leader, because at this point he's moving clearly towards that position if he isn't already there, but Riefenstahl's editing, that rhythmic editing, the presentation of him coming down through the clouds, all of it works together. And so the film is very much concerned with visualizing power and strength, political power and strength, associations with religion, the fact that everybody's in on this, just the number of German citizens who have become soldiers, the Hitler Youth, all of them together, all work towards presenting this image of power, this monolithic block of people that are all ready to go back to war to regain whatever lost glory they once had. So it is a way of showing military strength, right? By having this film do exactly that. Here's what we've got, right? So you want to be able to do it in such a way that, okay, we're going to show strength in character, because at this point you have to remember that the war has not been declared, and Allied forces are watching the German, industrialization. They're watching the German country to make sure they're not remilitarizing. So you have to be very careful, and you got to tread this fine line between saying that there is strength in character. We could go to war if we had to, but you don't. And you can't turn around and show the actual gear you've got. Look at all the tanks we have. Look at all the guns we have. Look at all the rest of it. So what is happening here is, in lieu of military hardware, such as something you would see in a parade in North Korea, huge missiles and all the rest of it, the Germans couldn't do this. They couldn't do that because they knew they would have been shut down immediately by the Allied forces as soon as they saw this film. So we had to show character of strength, strength of character. So he had to show that the people were powerful and the people were willing to fight. So the will to do this was what was important. So we have formations of soldiers. They're not fighting anybody. They're just there. We've got the Hitler Youth as well. Everybody's in on this thing, right? We're fully in. We've got the repetition of swastikas constantly to remind us, over and over again, who it is we're talking about. We've got eagles, which of course are associated with the Roman Empire. These are, again, images of power and strength. They're not tanks, are they? They're not weapons, but they are identifiers of power, of political power. And this is how Riefenstahl is able to not get around the censors, but present a kind of political power that is not going to be threatening necessarily, but there were still things that were going on prior to this that would have been causing a lot of concern, regardless of how heavily armed they were. So the Night of the Long Knives, Kristallnacht is what it was called. This was a purge that took place in Nazi Germany in June and July 1934, when the Nazi regime carried out a series of political murders. At least 85 people who were surprisingly critics of Hitler were all murdered. And so this happens, and the rally takes place in September 5th to the 10th. No mention of the opposition. No mention of people that were opposing Hitler. Everything's hunky-dory. Everything's good. No, we're all in on this. So don't worry. Everybody is good. So these are the kinds of things that propaganda films do not do. They do not present an opposing position. And if they do, they present it in such derogatory, denigrating ways that you couldn't possibly embrace it. You have to embrace the position they offer. So the distinction between Nazis and Germans is also done because we have this blurring between the German soldiers, members of the Nazi Party, individuals that we see close-ups of in the audience. So this idea of sort of collapsing the German identity down into the Nazi identity is done very, very effectively. But again, it's to present the power of the people, the strength of character these individuals have. So the actual gear that the Germans had was really not very much. So because they couldn't show the military might because they would have been shut down. But there's all this imagery of, iron crosses and eagles and swastikas, all to show the kind of power that could have been there. So we've got German farmers, we've got the Nazi forces, we've got men that are ready to work, and they're standing there with spades. They're calling out the region of Germany where they're from, and they're full in. All right, they're going to help out as much as they can. Now, by comparison, when we have a look at Night and Fog, which is, I found a link that works really well. An equally powerful film, but for entirely different reasons. I please urge you, once you watch this film, watch Night and Fog, and you will now be able to redress the balance, because this film, Triumph of the Will, is not a pleasant, it's not a pleasant day in the park. It's a difficult film to watch still, but please separate the form from the content. So, does this film make references to racial purity or the upcoming genocide? Of course not. Remember the message. Everybody's in love with Hitler. Everybody's part of the big group. We're all going to be in this big congregation. And we knew full well that was not the case. First it was Jews, then it was leftists, then it was communists and Marxists, and then school teachers, anybody that opposed the SS party. And eventually it was homosexuals and lesbians and gypsies and people that were physically infirmed. Everybody that opposed the party in any way, shape, or form, or not considered to be part of the pure race, were either killed or sent to concentration camps or jailed. None of that's in the film, is it? So the film does try to present a particular idea that somehow that everybody is enamored with the notion of Hitler, that they're all for him, when in fact, even at this point, there were people being murdered by Nazi forces, and nothing is mentioned in the film about it. Sure, the film is a document of a historical event, but yeah, it cherry picks the reality that it wishes to present to us. So Riefenstahl, again, she's had to own up to this film all her life, and she, I think, died in the 1970s, I believe, but she had to deal with it. And she said, I just observe and try to film it well. The idea that I helped the planet is downright absurd. Well, she did. She was a director. So she worked with Hitler to direct this film, to create this document that was going to help the Nazi Party. So even as late as 1964, so this is 20 years after the war is over, she said, the film should be seen as a total work of art. A total work of art is an idea that is I'm not going to say specifically German, but it's an idea that belongs to Wagner, who is a German composer. And he was thinking of opera as a total work of art that was choreography, music, singing, stage design. And she's trying to pawn off this idea that opera and Triumph of the Will share this notion of being a total work of art. Yes, it could be, but for entirely different reasons. So the totality of of this document called Triumph of the Will is one where we're watching all pistons firing at the same time, but all towards the same cause, whether it's visually, musically, camera angles, editing, all those things work together and in its totality to present this notion of Hitler as this godlike figure that is going to save the German people. But really, at the end of the day, all that's happening is Riefenstahl is again saying, I'm not responsible. I'm not responsible. Keep that phrase in mind when you read through the passages on Night and Fog in this book and Triumph of the Will, because it is really important. It goes a long way towards people who now are associated with a horrific, part of history, trying to excuse themselves. And again, Kevin Hajopian says Triumph of the Will, like Birth of the Nation, presents a great conundrum of art, right? This dilemma of art. Can art be both morally reprehensible and yet great? Riefenstahl was imprisoned by the Allies after the war and then released, partly because no one could figure out if a film could be an instrument of war, right? Was this film instrumental in killing someone? Riefenstahl was adamant. She had been concerned with matters of form, not politics, or in our case, matters of form, not content. Think about it. Can a director turn around and say, I'm not responsible. I just followed the orders. She embraced it. Now, does that mean that every single director stayed behind and suffered? No. Fritz Lang, who's a German director, took off as quickly as he realized how bad these people were going to be. There were intellectuals, there were artists, there were singers, there were composers, filmmakers. A whole number of people bolted as quickly as they could when they realized this guy was bad news, right? This guy was a murderer. Riefenstahl knew, looked the other way. Another quote from Roger Ebert. I felt that it would involve grappling with the question of whether evil art can be great art. Since moral art can obviously be bad art, the answer to the flip side seems to be clear enough. But it took me a fearsome struggle to thrash out The Birth of a Nation, even though many more excuses of time, place, and context can be offered for Griffith than for Riefenstahl. And what he means by that last statement is Birth of a Nation does deal with presenting the KKK in a positive light as heroes. But Riefenstahl's film led to the genocide of at least 6 million people and to the Second World War. So we can count all of those people who died. So that film is far more difficult to excuse and far more damning as a historical document than, say, Birth of a Nation, which was fiction. Okay, so in wrapping up here, what I want to point out to you is the fact that propaganda is still used today. We like to call it persuasion, but it still is propagandizing in various ways. And we have to be wary of it because we are living in a time where very few companies own many media outlets. So whatever that company wishes to present to us as the truth, this is what we are left with. Now, luckily enough, depending on what access we have to social media or to cable or internet at least, we have a variety of different positions that we can consider as we read and hear and view, a particular historical event. So we can decide whether or not Fox News is telling the truth, or CNN, or Al Jazeera, or BBC, or Sky, or whoever. We now have the choice. So media incorporates strategies that are like propaganda, without actually being the kind of propaganda we've been talking about, explicitly leaving out historical facts, explicitly cherry picking the world so that it presents, their idea in the best way possible. Now, advertising, public service announcements, political rallies and campaigns are forms of propaganda. Vote for me, I'm your guy. Advertising, buy this product and you'll be really popular with whoever it is you want to be popular with. Public service announcements, which are PSAs, against drunk driving, against shoplifting, against any number of things. Public service announcements are forms of propaganda. Why? Because it's a document looking to change our behavior, our minds. Editorials can also be considered forms of propaganda because in an editorial, we know that whatever is written on those pages is the opinion of a certain person. Now, that senior editorial staff member can, have 30 or 40 years of wisdom from working in this paper and knowing what's going on, they probably have something reasonable to say, and they can probably balance their opinion, I would hope, with some kind of verifiable facts. But when you think of an editorial, it is still an opinion piece, and opinion pieces can waver between opinion and truth, and we need to be able to identify which is which, because if not, we end up with some serious issues where we end up with, somebody pouncing off an opinion as a fact. And that's not the case. And this is kind of where we're at now. We have a whole range of people screaming and arguing about a whole range of things that are associated with the pandemic we are all presently going through, because it's affecting everybody globally, literally around the world. And yet there are people that are convinced that somehow being vaccinated is you're going to be, you're going to have a microchip in your arm, or if you're going to be involved in contact tracing, that somehow it's going to be some vast conspiracy of surveillance. No, it's not at all. But it's the way in which people present these opinions that they have as somehow verifiable facts, and do it in such a way that you leave no other option. That if you do the opposite of what they say, you're some kind of degenerate loser. And that's what propaganda does. It offers an either or position, that is, the or is so horrible that you have to buy into the position that they are kind of propagating. So propaganda is still around, but when you are listening to something and someone's presenting an opinion as fact, be careful, because they are trying to indoctrinate you in some kind of political view, some kind of worldview or conspiracy theory or whatever. So the best way to do that is to manipulate one's emotions, play on someone's fears, or worse, play on someone's prejudices. Because when you start doing that, you've now opened up that avenue that is not critical, that is not objective, that is not able to reflect. Because emotions, fear, and prejudice are not critical faculties. They're emotional faculties. And when we're thinking this way, we're not thinking clearly, and we're definitely not thinking critically. So I hopefully have unpacked Triumph of the Will to the best of my abilities. It's an awful film. Like I say, focus on the form, focus on the camera movements, focus on the editing, focus on how something is presented, not what is being presented, but how it is being presented, and you can get through it. Now, after that, this is our feature film, and there will be a quiz on this film. I would like you to also have a look at Night and Fog, which is a meditation on death, meditation on the concentration camps, and also meditation on memory. Because having something like this happen in your backyard, and time and things sort of, forgetting and history and forgetting and memory, these things all roll into one. Night and Fog is a very compelling poetic view, if that's even possible, because it is about concentration camps. It poses these kinds of questions. How will we remember this? It is very effective. Now, there's also a couple of other clips, or not clips, but one is about a 15-minute kind of documentary on propaganda, and specifically Triumph of the Will, which you don't have to watch it, but I would recommend having a look at it, because it deals visually with a lot of the ideas I've been presenting. So it talks about propaganda, specifically Triumph of the Will, and breaks down with examples the very things that I've been talking about. And then finally, the last one, and this is just to undercut the whole Nazi ideology and agenda. Riefenstahl thought that she was being an innovative filmmaker when she was filming the crowd scenes in the Nuremberg rally and shooting blocks of people. And she thought, wow, this is terrific. What I'd like you to consider and watch is a short little dance sequence from a Busby Berkeley musical made the same year. And you'll see very quickly that no, Leni Riefenstahl didn't invent anything. She stole from Hollywood on how to film and depict groups of people. So if you laugh at it and go, wow, this is pretty laughable, good. That's what I'd like you to do. But do have a look at the Busby Berkeley musical, because you will recognize an awful lot of similar movements of people, and especially the way they're shot in both films. But the musical came first. So It's Sunday afternoon, about 2:30. Have a good weekend, and we're going to see each other hopefully on Wednesday. We can talk a little bit more about the essays. We can talk a little bit more about the project that's coming up in a few weeks on handing in a bibliography for your forthcoming paper. But in the meantime, just do have a look at the films, and we'll see each other again on Wednesday. So take care, and we'll see you soon.